Okay, so officially, welcome to our October webinar. Our topic for tonight is understanding skin picking trances. As usually, I will talk for about 45 minutes. I'm reluctant to give precise times because every time I say how much I will talk, I basically break my own rule. And then after this, we'll go to the Q&A section. You can ask questions using the Q&A option in your window, and I will get to all of them in the end. There's also a poll that's active, if you haven't seen, where you can vote for the topic for next month. As I can see, currently habit reversal training is leading, but it was quite a tight race. I was observing it between perfectionism avoidance and habit reversal, but apparently habit reversal is the most popular one for now. So when we finish everything before we wrap up, before the Q&A, I will close the poll, and then I will see what the topic will be for next month. So let's get started with skin picking trances. There has to be a reason. Okay, so this is me, very uneventful, but the point of this slide is for those of you who are new. You can see that there is a discount of $60 for the first month for everyone who joins in the next 7 days. So you can use the coupon and then get started with the program if you haven't already. I will say a few words about SkinPick in the end, and I also put the coupon in the end so you will be able to write it down. So this is what we'll be talking about tonight. So first, we'll try to define what a skin picking trance is. Then we will talk about what's the purpose of a trance, like why is it that anyone would slip into that state. Then, if this is your first webinar, let's ask Kelly, maybe doesn't mean much, but if you've been here before, I guess you could have anticipated that one. So we'll explore a little bit of what Kelly's psychology would tell us, what constructivist psychology has to say about this. Then we'll talk about how to stop a trance and how to prevent one. And then we'll move on to the Q&A. So this was quite an interesting topic to research and think about, mainly because there's really not much written about it. And it is a term that people very often use. It's obviously, let's say, a legitimate phenomenon, but there's just no one seems to have written about it extensively. So basically, I had to look at what clinical experiences I have and look at the stories that people write in the SkinPick program and then extract from there. So we will start exactly the way I started preparing for this, which is by looking at the stories that people have shared with me, or at least several stories that I was allowed to share. So here's one description. It says, one scab leads to another, and then suddenly I feel completely trapped by picking. Before I realize it, an hour has passed. It's as if I'm possessed. I know I shouldn't be doing it, but I just can't stop. Then another. The whole world goes away, and there's nothing but this insatiable need to make my skin smooth. No bumps, no pimples, no scabs, no irregularities of any kind. And everything is magnified, and every piece of skin I peel off feels like a reward. Let's see another one. It's the best kind of picking in a bad way. It's just so satisfying, it doesn't motivate me to stop. I can't get enough of picking, but then after I feel so guilty. How can I keep doing this to myself? And one more. Yesterday I had an argument with my boss, and when I got home, I screwed up the dinner because I was half asleep and had to order takeout. Great, more unhealthy food. My youngest is sick, so he's extra difficult and cranky. In the end, I went to the bathroom and picked for over an hour. It was like I went on vacation. But now I feel horrible. What's wrong with me? So these four stories were sort of how I started thinking about this, because I think these four contain all the important elements of what we talk about when we talk about a skin picking trance. So let's just summarize this in one place. So we're talking about a prolonged picking episode. We're talking about an episode that's very difficult, even impossible to stop with competing responses. So with those basic tools that we teach at SkinPick or really any form of behavioral therapy, it doesn't seem to work. It's characterized by a state of absorption and focus on the experience. And then this last one is particularly important, which is that there's a lack of awareness of external stimuli. So you're so completely focused and immersed in picking that basically everything else stops existing for this period of time. Even the idea that time is flowing itself. Because in, I think, 2 of these stories, there was this moment where you don't even realize how much time has passed. So, prolonged episode, state of absorption and focus, and lack of awareness of your surroundings. So why is it that we have skin picking trances? So a trance can be seen as a radical example of something we call experiential avoidance in acceptance and commitment therapy. So what is experiential avoidance, you might ask? So it's a type of behavior, I guess we can call it a defense mechanism, where you employ certain behaviors and strategies and actions in order to avoid experiences that you have difficulties coping with. So for example, very frequently people will use picking as a way to not deal with stress, or as a way to avoid anger, or as a way to avoid disappointment, or as a way to avoid guilt, or any kind of experience that you find completely overwhelming. So this puts us in a very strange position, which is, if we want to understand the function of a picking trance, we actually need to examine what's not there instead of what is there. Because the function of the trance is to avoid something. So the cause is not in the experience itself, it's outside of it. That kind of makes it a tricky thing to figure out, because consciously you're not necessarily aware of what's causing it. Before we proceed, I just want to mention, because you know that I like to babble about art on and on. This is a painting by a Swedish painter called Hilda af Klint, and I used several of her paintings. She's now considered to be the first truly abstract painter, even before Kandinsky. And she was really not known as an abstract painter because her early attempts to show her paintings to people didn't really go so well. So she packed over 1,000 of them in her studio and left it to someone and said that it should not be open for a long time. So people are only now starting to discover her work. To be perfectly honest, I find her work quite underwhelming, but even though I love abstract art, just not hers. But there's something about her art that I think is really appropriate for this topic, which is that her abstract paintings were channeled, so she would paint them in a trance, all of it in one, in one piece, let's say, with no planning, nothing. So who or what she was channeling, I really don't know, but it is a piece of art created in a trance. So I thought it would be more than appropriate to use some of her works. So let's, in order to discover, so I'm digressing as usually. So in order to discover the function, then we need to see what's not in the story. And I used the last example, the 4th story, to kind of emphasize what the client left out, or rather what she wrote but didn't really write. So let's see what is it that she was actually avoiding. So I added things in the brackets here. So let's go over the story again. So she says, yesterday I had an argument with my boss, so she was angry. And when I got home, I screwed up the dinner, so she was disappointed. Because I was half asleep, so she was exhausted because she had a very long day. And I had to order takeout. Disappointment again. Great, more unhealthy food. Guilt. Why guilt, you might ask? Because you don't know the whole story of the client. When she was in session 7 of the program, and when we talked about setting goals, one of the goals that she set was to introduce more healthy habits so that she and her family would be healthier after she had a health scare. So one of the goals that she had was to eat healthy. because that was related to values such as self-care and obviously health. So deviating from that caused her to feel guilty. Then she says, my youngest is sick. So there's the sense of obligation to help. There's also a fear for the person you love. So he's extra difficult and cranky, meaning that she was powerless to actually help him in a way that as a mother she felt she should. In the end, I went to the bathroom, and this is, I think, one point of active agency here. This is one conscious choice that she made, and picked for over an hour in a trance. It was like I went on vacation, so relief and calm. But now I feel horrible. What's wrong with me? So there's guilt, and then there's, of course, self-judgment on top of guilt. So I hope this is, you're following me for now. So if some of these emotions don't seem quite logical to you, I hope that the example is clear, but I discussed each of these with the client through our correspondence in the program, so I'm pretty confident about the emotions behind it. So what she described basically was a sequence of events, but what she left out of her writing is what was sort of driving her behavior. As you can see, she's basically going from one difficult experience to another. And there's no pause in between, if you notice. So there's no place where she said, so then I took a walk to calm down or something like this. So it's just basically piling up bad experiences. So let's simplify it even further to leave out the words and just look at the emotions that were left out. So what we basically have here is that during the day, so the numbers mean nothing, just ignore those. So during the day, there was an accumulation of bad experiences. There was a difficult day at work, there was the fight with her boss, and there was the dinner that didn't go well. And that sort of the experiences accumulated as much as she could possibly put up with them until the green arrow here. And then this is the moment where she says, well, then I went to the bathroom and started peeking for 1 hour. So this is where her difficult experiences kind of reach their plateau, where she consciously makes a choice to go to the bathroom and just stop the day. It's basically like saying enough. And then as she picks, like she says, it's like going on vacation. She has this intense relief during the picking and immediately afterwards. In fact, so much so that she is almost completely relaxed in the end. And then what happens is that when she realized the damage that she did and how much time had passed, she felt guilt and shame, which made her feel tense again. So what does this illustrate? First, it tells us that the sudden trance that basically, if you read her story, it happened because she just went to the bathroom and started peeking. It wasn't really so sudden after all. It was essentially a culmination of a horrible day that she had. But if you had asked her if she had a horrible day, she wouldn't have said that. She just listed those events, almost unaware of how difficult each of them individually was. So there were many, many difficult experiences, which we see here. And then we also see why is it that the trance actually worked. It wasn't a healthy thing to do. It wasn't a very pleasant thing to do, but it worked. When I say that it worked, I see that some of you are raising your hands. Please use the Q&A to ask questions, and I promise I will answer them when I'm done. So the reason why I say that the trance worked is because she experienced an incredible amount of relief and calm afterwards. So it reduced her tension that she wasn't even fully aware of. So that's why it sustains itself, because it performs a function. And then you see this little upswing here, which is the guilt and shame that she felt afterwards. And this part here with the guilt and the shame and the self-judgment is exactly how these picking episodes sort of perpetuate themselves. Because she was really calm, so that was good. But then tension spiked up again, creating basically a new curve that she has to climb up. It's like a new cycle. So it ends one cycle of tension, it calms you down because it has this soothing effect, and then guilt and shame kind of start the process all over again. So when we analyze the trances, we will talk about the first part of the curve, how difficult emotions accumulate and what happens when we don't process them. But even more, I will pay attention to this part of relief, because this is the part that actually works. This is the function of the trance. So this is incredibly important to address. Okay, so let's see. In this example, we see a buildup of negative emotions during the day, but emotions that people usually don't tend to pay attention to. So as they pile up, you feel worse and worse. But if you don't pay attention to each individual emotion, it's really difficult to say, why is it that you even feel bad? You just feel that something is wrong because you don't really analyze the emotions and you don't take care of them. They kind of become this strange mass of everything. It's like when people say, I felt uncomfortable, it basically means I felt anything negative. So that's what happens when we carry around these experiences but don't really fully understand them or process them, or at least take some time to deal with them. So eventually she seeks relief in picking. So absorption of the picking trance soothes her without having to process anything that happened that day. So it does provide relief and soothing, but it has this additional little thing, which is that she didn't have to process her emotions. Not at one point did she sit and then analyze what had happened, what is it that made her feel that way, what is it that she could have done, what is it that she needed in certain situations. So picking relieves you of these difficult experiences, but it allows you to do that by never actually understanding them. So this is how experiential avoidance works. You basically get the benefits without having to dig into the unpleasant side that you don't like to see. Is it healthy? No, but it is very important to understand the mechanism and how it works. So let's see what Kelly has to say about this. So for those of you that are here for the first time, I will just briefly explain what is the fundamental idea behind Kelly's theory, and then we will see specifically how his theory can explain picking trances. So Kelly basically had this idea that every person is like a scientist. So as we go about living, talking, making decisions, doing things, all of that is scientific work for Kelly. It's scientific insofar as everything that we do is testing some kind of hypothesis, which is really what scientists do. They try to predict events by forming hypotheses, and then when they test them, they see what works and what doesn't work. So those that work, we keep. Those that don't work, we don't keep. In previous webinars, I expanded on Kelly's theory in different directions, and I'm not going to go into deep details here about how this personal science works, because it's not necessary. Here, I will pay attention to something else, which is that when we talk about people as scientists, it sounds very general, very vague. But in reality, science is always precisely defined, meaning that every scientific discipline has its field, right? There's a certain number of phenomena that fall under its umbrella and some that don't. And the same thing goes for our, let's say, personal science, our kind of daily scientific activity, which is that we test different hypotheses in different contexts, and they all have certain range of limitation. So for example, the set of hypotheses that I have about myself and the world when I'm a therapist is not necessarily the same set of hypotheses that I employ in my daily life. When I finish my work, I leave my hypotheses in my office, and then I start using a different set with my friends or in other contexts. And most of us do that. This is a healthy adaptive process. I cannot be a therapist 24 hours a day, the same way that a social worker cannot be a social worker 24 hours a day, or indeed a scientist, professional scientist, cannot be a scientist 24 hours a day. So we kind of have these groups of little theories that we use in certain situations. So why is this important? If you use this metaphor to understand the story that we analyzed more deeply previously, you can see that what happened to my client as a scientist is that her theories were invalidated the whole day. So at work, she got into a fight with her boss. She was my client, well, she still is, but she finished the program. But so she's a person that cares a lot about her career. It's extremely important to her. And so when you're invalidated at your work, it's really a core invalidation. It invalidates an important part of who you are. That may not be the case for everyone, but for my client, it was. So when she's invalidated at work, basically that means that her hypotheses and her theories about her job and her role at work were shaken up. They were invalidated. They were not useful. So you have this whole huge chunk of your life that you cannot make sense of anymore because your theories were at least temporarily invalidated, if not permanently. And then what's left is basically that you have no tools to deal with something, and you have no way to attribute meaning to what's happening. It's a very anxiety-provoking, stressful situation. And so to her, this happened at work, and then it happened at home, and then her son was also sick, so that was also invalidating in a way, because no matter how much she tried, she couldn't really deal with him because he was very young, and kids are kids. So babies are meant to invalidate their parents. So that's basically what happened. So in every major aspect of her life, she was invalidated over the course of one day. It's basically like someone destroying a whole science in one day. Then you would still have scientists who would now be able to throw away all their knowledge, and then all you would have is just anxiety, because they would have no way to explain whatever it is that they're studying. Okay, I hope this is clear for now. So the question is, when we are invalidated in these subtle or not so subtle ways, what is it that we do? So Kelly says that we don't really give up on our hypotheses that easily. It's not like someone says, you know, you're wrong, or you get into a fight with your boss and then suddenly you give up the way you look at the world. That's not quite the case. Usually we will try to keep the core of our hypotheses because we really don't want to let them go. They are who we are in the end of the day. What we will usually do is we will try to change the field that we're studying, so to speak. So we will either make our field of awareness bigger and introduce new elements, or we'll make it smaller by taking some elements out. But either way, what we will achieve in this way is to either validate our theory again, just on a more comprehensive level, or we will remove all those elements that don't fit with our theory and just leave those that do, by narrowing our field of awareness. So Kelly called these two processes dilation and constriction. I used two paintings here to illustrate the process. So the one on the right, this is a detail from the Last Judgment by Hieronymus Bosch. And this is just one part of the painting. So if you know the painting, you know what it looks like entirely. It's a huge painting, and it's huge in the sense that there are dozens of people in there. Just look at this little fragment here. You have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's people, strange demons, there's so much. This is what dilation looks like. We introduce more and more and more elements into our life. And what we do what we hope for when we do this is that when we have so many elements, even if some of them don't fit, the overall structure will remain intact. So when our theory about the world is invalidated, what we do is we add more elements so that we get some validation somewhere in there. Because if one of these figures isn't right, that doesn't make the whole painting bad, right? So you can allow yourself to paint some parts of it badly because it's so complex that when you look at it, you're not likely to notice that not everything may be perfect. So that's dilation. In real life, what this looks like is, for example, if you really care about people liking you, and then you can never say no to whatever it is they ask of you, every new favor you agree to do, or every new thing you want to do, every new appointment you have, is just another element in your field of awareness. So you're basically expanding it. The opposite process from that would be constriction. The painting I used to illustrate that is the Black Square by Vladimir Miletic, because this is just a very simple thing. It's just one element painted on the canvas. It's just one black square. So this is constriction. When we remove everything that doesn't really work and that we cannot currently make sense of, and then we reduce our world to just those elements that work. One example is when you have a very bad day and then you stay in bed the whole day. Basically, what you do there is you say, I'm going to reduce my world to my room or my apartment or my bed, and I'm not going to concern myself with anything that's outside. Because all my science that would be able to predict and control what's outside doesn't work. So I'm going to stay here where everything works well. Another example would be when you're depressed, or if you meditate. Meditation can be a type of constriction as well, because if you do meditation that emphasizes focus over awareness, what you basically do is you will direct all your capacities to, let's say, follow your breath. So your entire world reduces to your breath in certain moments when your focus is very stable. So this is a healthy mechanism that we all use in life. This is not something that's necessarily a problem. In fact, Kelly's idea is that all our hypotheses are sort of very fluid. So we kind of move between dilation and constriction all the time, depending on what we need to stay functional. When a peaking trance occurs, I assume that would be clear by now, it's an extreme form of constriction, where you kick out almost everything from your orbit and you stay focused only on peaking. And this is the only element that exists for you in that time. And this is something that you can control, and this is something where all your hypotheses work perfectly. If your goal is to have smooth skin, then the goal is very clear, and you know exactly what you're doing. And that's one part of your world that still works, whereas the rest you can completely ignore. Another way, for example, to constrict would be to read a book, at least for me. That's one thing that I can always count on, is that if I have a bad day, I will read a book and forget about the external world. So essentially, both constriction and dilation are normal psychological processes. It's just that sometimes we use them in a way that's not maybe the healthiest for us. But there's nothing wrong in either of these two. Okay, I already said that it's a way of achieving constriction. So it's a way to reduce our world to what works. So if you want to really understand how constriction works and why it's such a beneficial mechanism in certain situations, look at your own past experiences. Like, what are some other ways that you constrict your life? Again, I mean, let's say healthy ways that you do that. Is it that you write, or is it that you paint, or sing, or play an instrument? For example, yeah, if you play a music instrument, that's a very good example of constriction, because when you're in it, you're in it. So the reason why I'm saying that you should explore where is it that this is not something you can answer very easily and quickly now. It's something to think about. But the reason why I'm saying that you should think about this is because, according to Kelly's theory, then absorption that we get from picking serves the function of sort of reducing our world to something that works, and that can be achieved in many different ways. So the urge to pick, or the urge to kind of go into this intense picking episode, you can actually replace with something that will provide a similar kind of shelter from the world. So what I would invite you to think about is all these things that you do or did at some point in your life that would provide this kind of safe constriction, let's say. So how to stop a trance? So this is a work by Yayoi Kusama, but I guess if you know art, then just by seeing the dots, it should be fairly obvious. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how to stop it, and then how to prevent it, and then we'll go to the Q&A. In terms of stopping the trance, it's really very difficult to speak about specific. I will propose, of course, some specific techniques, but in my experience with clients in SkinPick, it's really very individual what works and what doesn't. I've noticed certain trends, things that are more likely to work, and times when they're more likely to work. So I will give you these, let's say, general ways, and I will give you some practical techniques that might help with that. But you should really be free to explore and try out different things. Just follow the principles that I outlined. So before you can actually talk about prevention or stopping them, you really have to get to know them well. This is the part, for those of you that are in the program, about acceptance and willingness. I believe it's session 5, if I'm not mistaken. So in order to change anything, you really have to look at it very, very carefully. This is always the first step. So you have to see if your peaking trances are sudden or if they're gradual. If they're sudden, look more carefully. Sometimes they will seem sudden, but this is because you avoid a lot of your experiences probably. And then when the urge to pick comes out in a very strong way, it seems like it's just one event, but it's actually just your body screaming that you've been neglecting it for a very long time. So even if it feels sudden, there is always something that preceded it. In general, it is very useful to think that nothing in our psyche is random or accidental. Elements can fall in randomly, but then they will occur only once. If something happens over and over and over again, there is usually a rule to this. So what your first task is to figure out what are the events that contribute to the trance eventually occurring. If you do journaling of any kind, this might be very helpful. If you use the self-monitoring app, you can also use that. So anything that will allow you to record how your emotional life changes during the day. I know that there are some apps, I don't use any of them, but I know that they exist, where you can basically track your mood from day to day or your emotions. So what you can do is you can schedule certain times every day where you will take maybe like a minute, doesn't take much more than that, to figure out how you feel, or to maybe identify what caused you to feel stressed up to that point during the day. And then once a week or every 2 weeks, you can review your logs and see what is it that contributes to the tension being worse. So it's very important to sort of plot this. Then you need to figure out if your triggers are internal or external. If you want to split psychological hairs, you can say that every trigger is eventually internal, because what triggers us is not something external, it's the meaning that we attribute to it. But for everyday practical purposes, it is very useful to distinguish between internal and external triggers. In the case of my client, their external triggers would be a fight with her boss, the dinner that didn't go well, her son being sick, for example. Those would be external triggers. Internal triggers can be ruminations, or rather the thoughts that keep repeating in our minds. When people say that they tend to pick very intensely when they're bored, for example, to me, that's a cue that we should be looking for internal triggers. Because boredom essentially means that there's nothing outside or inside that you would direct your focus to. And if there's nothing that you want to focus on, that likely means that you're ruminating about something. And when you're ruminating about something, that's usually not anything good. So in these situations, when there's an absence of external events, where you should be looking for triggers is in your thoughts and in your emotions. If you're having a hard time identifying what you feel, well, first, vote for that topic in the poll. And then second thing to do is to focus on your body sensations and then track these. Because all or at least most of our intense emotions have a certain correlate in our bodies. So like if you're anxious, you will feel your heart racing or your palms sweating or things like this. If you're, I don't know, in love, so that I'm not only talking about bad things, you can feel butterflies in your stomach. So there's always something happening in your body. We tend to ignore our bodies as much as we can, but that's, again, not the healthiest thing to do. So if you want to figure out internal emotional triggers, that's one way that you can go about doing that. Then where are you when trances happen? Not necessarily where you are when triggers occur, but where are you physically when it is happening? Are you alone? Do you separate yourself from other people? Do you make sure that there's really no one around to separate from? How does this actually happen? Are there some rooms that are particularly risky? In my experience, a bathroom is always a dangerous place, let's say. In terms of prevention, this can help as a type of stimulus control. If you identified the kind of gradual gradual accumulation of, let's say, anxiety or stress, and you've noticed the presence of certain triggers, then you know to avoid certain rooms, or at least to emphasize stimulus control techniques from session 3 so that you're protected when you go into these rooms. Who is close to you? And I mean this in both ways. I mean, who is emotionally close to you, and then who is physically very close to you when picking occurs. External resources are extremely important when we talk about these intense picking episodes. And then, of course, what are the emotions that you're having a hard time coping with and understanding? This is not as easy to identify, but if you track your behaviors, your sensations, your thoughts, events in your life, even in a journal, you should be able to at least reconstruct this retroactively, even if you can't identify it in the moment. So let's see what are some practical techniques that might work. Oh, this painting, I'm sorry that I'm explaining every painting. This is Lee Krasner. I really love her work. She was Jackson Pollock's wife, and she was very unfairly neglected while he was alive because, well, he was a giant, and so she was overshadowed, but she was a terrific painter. So you always have to have a strategy plan prepared in advance. There's no improvising when it comes to something so intense as a picking trance. So you have to have everything ready. There are two basic types of strategies here. Things that you do alone and things that you do with the help of someone else. All of them have one purpose and one purpose only, which is to pull you out of the trance. So we don't work on alleviating it or stopping it. What we're really looking for is to interrupt it. Because if we could work, let's say, within the trance, so if we could work with the urge, like you do when you apply competing responses, where you redirect the urge onto something else, that would be really easy to deal with, but it's not the case. Because the first thing that flies out the window when a picking trance comes is your competing response. You know you should use it, but you just somehow cannot bring yourself to do that, or you try and it doesn't work, and then things escalate. So essentially what you need is something to pull you out. Ideally, you will have an external distraction to use. So that would be a person that's close to you, like an accountability partner. This can be a little bit tricky when there's a lot of shame surrounding picking, but it is the absolute best way, which is if you have someone that's close to you, that lives with you, just call them or establish a code word or, I don't know, a gesture or something that to give them a signal that they need to come and do whatever they have to get you out of the bathroom or whatever else you may pick. Another thing that you can do is a cold shower, and that really works well, although it's not the most gentle of methods. But it is something that will snap you out of the experience of picking precisely because it's so unpleasant. The reason why I said cold shower is because it is unpleasant, but it's not harmful in any way. So it's a healthy way to snap yourself out of it. There's another thing that you can do, which is to redirect the urge onto an activity or an object, but I don't mean to replace it like you would with a competing response. I mean to use the emotional charge that you feel and then externalize it. Scream at someone, yell. I had a client who had a, I don't know how you call that, like one of those boxing bags or whatever they are. And then she would hit those, for example, and that was useful. You can destroy something, hit a pillow. So anything that will allow you to get those emotions out in a very raw form. If you want to try something more subtle, that would be to use focusing on the body or grounding. Although if I look at people who find this useful, those that don't, people who practice mindfulness regularly will usually find this very beneficial. Because in order to focus on your body and observe it without giving into the urge, you need a dose of equanimity and the stability of focus, which you get from practicing meditation. When I say emotional self-talk, so I don't mean that you give yourself a pep talk, like saying, oh, you can do this. And I most certainly don't mean that you're being aggressive towards yourself or judge yourself. What I mean by emotional self-talk is actually to reverse the effect of experiential avoidance. What you do here, I think I talked about a version of this when we had the webinar on emotional regulation. Essentially, the principle here is that you start describing your experience, and you essentially narrate your emotional experiences. If you cannot identify an emotion, again, you start by describing what you feel in your body. You describe how you feel the urge. You do that out loud, that's one thing. And the second of all, you do it slowly. And slow talk has two specific purposes. One is that you create a little bit of a distance between yourself and the urge. It acts similar, you know how when you're supposed to log into something and then they make you click on every picture that has a bus or every picture that has, I don't know, train, and then you miss like one corner of a taxi somewhere and you have to do it again. It's extremely frustrating, but in terms, and that the slow talk is the equivalent of that. And it's helpful because it distances you from the intensity of the urge. And it allows for something else, which is as you speak slowly about what's happening inside your body, you have the time to reflect on how your body reacts to your talk. Essentially, what you do is you connect yourself to your own emotional responses. What this will usually do is that it will convert the intensity of the peaking trance into something like crying or sadness. And experiencing sadness or crying or experiencing anger or whatever else is not very pleasant, but it is healthy. So it's not going to be a pretty experience, but you will do several important things. First, you will end the peaking trance. Second of all, you will understand what is it that you actually feel. You will learn how to tolerate your emotions. And then afterwards, once the emotions sort of settle down, you can actually rationally sit down and reflect on them and see what is it that you can do to prevent it next time. Or at the end of the day, I hinted this, but I never really had a webinar where I talked about emotions explicitly. But Kelly's theory has a very good way of looking at emotions. His general idea is that emotions are actually information. They're just messages. We don't really intuitively understand them because we live in a culture that places so much emphasis on thinking and under quotation marks being rational and things like this. So we don't really learn how to decode these messages. But intense emotions are just extremely important messages in your bodies. Sometimes when people are in the program and then somewhere along the way, when they start spontaneously understanding their urges to pick as a message that you need to take care of a part of your personality, I always get very happy because for me, that's true progress, that you actually understand fundamentally how you can benefit from having the urge instead of sort of trying to will it away, let's say. So that would be a way to slowly connect you to your emotions. Then we have RAIN. RAIN is a mindfulness-based technique that I think I explained sometime previously, but just briefly, it's an acronym, means recognize, accept, investigate, and non-identify or nurture, depends on who you ask. But what its purpose is that you observe your emotional experience and then detach from it. So that tends to be a very effective technique. And the one that I always advise people to start with are the breathing exercises. There are two that I particularly like because they're very simple to remember and they're quite effective. One is called 3x3 and the other one is called box breathing. 3x3 is very simple. It's you inhale deeply, hold for 3 seconds, exhale, and then repeat that 3 times. Box breathing is somewhat more complex, but not that much. I guess you could call box breathing 4x4. You inhale slowly for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds, exhale slowly for 4 seconds, and then don't inhale again for the next 4 seconds, and then repeat the cycle. The reason why breathing exercises work is because they actually have an effect on your body, not just creating a distance or making you more mindful. They actually alter the way your body works for a period of time. I don't think, let me see what time it is. Yeah, so I don't have time to go into details about how changing your breathing will change the oxygen, CO2 levels in your body and how that affects the way you actually feel, but there is a physiological mechanism behind it. The only thing with breathing exercises is that sometimes I will tell people to try them out, And then they will do that for about 20 seconds, and then they will say, well, it doesn't work. A breathing exercise has to be done for a few minutes, so 1, 2, or 3 minutes. Ideally, you can even combine these. You can start with a breathing exercise and then see what else on the list or outside of the list might work for you. And I have to say, other than finding someone who will actually get into the room and drag you out of it, all these are effective only in the beginning. So you have to be very quick. This is why identifying triggers and how tension grows is crucial, because you have a very small window when the picking trance starts before there's essentially nothing outside of someone throwing cold water on you or just dragging you out of the room. So you have to be very vigilant, and you have to have a lot of willingness. Just please keep that in mind. Essentially, the best way to deal with them in the long run is to work so that they don't actually occur. This is why I emphasize so much studying how they actually arise in your experience. Because once you figure out what triggers them, you can slowly find strategies to address each step individually so that much tension never really accumulates. So what are preventative strategies aimed at? So what we do is that we should implement techniques that will alleviate preventable causes. So what you need to do is, one, take a step back and sort of figure out what the cause is specifically for you. You can start, so if you're in therapy, then we'll figure it out together, or you can figure it out with whoever your therapist is. If you're doing this alone, which I know that a lot of you are, one thing that you can do is first just step back and then just write down everything that may have caused it, even if you're not really sure whether or not it did or didn't. If it seems like it could have contributed, then fine. When you make a list, make it as big a list as you possibly can. As you read the list, read it slowly and see sort of what thoughts it triggers. What themes can you see repeating through the list? So find whatever repeats. There's always a pattern. That's I guess the same thing. Psychology is very, very fragmented, and different theories have very different ideas about what causes what. But one thing is always present, which is that there's always a pattern to something. How you will verbally explain it, what labels you'll use, that's a different matter, but identifying a pattern is the first thing, right? And then once you figure out what is it that you avoid, you can work on actually opening up to these difficult experiences. This is a very complex process, and it's very hard to give specific instructions for people who do it on their own, because in therapy, we do it step by step and kind of slowly. So I suppose what you could do is just focus on learning how to be more observant of what's happening in your body by practicing whatever kind of body awareness you want. And then slowly starting to feel it. If tears are starting to come, let them come out, and then just observe the tears. If you feel something in your chest, just watch it carefully. Watching it carefully means that you get to learn about that, but at the same time, you're basically practicing how to not react to that. So then so for example, when I teach people mindfulness, but not the beginners, like people who want to learn a little bit more, and then we will at one point start doing very long sittings. So I will give them a task to sit 1 hour every day, for example, and not 3 times for 20 minutes, just one time sitting for 60 minutes without moving. And then oftentimes they will start reporting that they feel pain, because if you sit in an uncomfortable position, your back will hurt, your shoulders can hurt, all kinds of things can hurt. And it's extremely unpleasant. And I remember when I was starting, even today, if I sit for a very long time when I do mindfulness, something will hurt and it's very unpleasant. But with years, as you learn to observe your pain, you develop this very particular attitude towards it, which is that you're kind of curious about it, you can look at it, but the intensity of the pain or discomfort doesn't really sway you either way. You don't actually have to move. So when you observe what's happening in your body, even if you can't precisely identify it, you are doing this very same thing. It's like the gym for your mind. You're practicing to stay stable and observe your experience. You don't dissociate from experience like you would with experiential avoidance, you're opening up to it because you're inviting it in. There are a few books by Pema Chodron, if you like to read about a mindfulness-based approach. I do have to warn you, she writes from a very openly Buddhist perspective, but her books are really, really well insofar as they all emphasize different ways in which you can welcome these difficult experiences. I think one of her books is actually called Welcoming the Unwelcome. I know that it sounds very counterintuitive to just tell people, well, open up to difficult experiences, but that is the only way that you can understand them. And then, of course, learn how to process emotions and how to set boundaries. When I say process emotions, I don't really mean, I don't talk about something, that has any kind of new agey meaning. I'm very practical about these things. So processing emotions means knowing what you feel, knowing how it's called, and understanding what message it carries. Very simple three-step process. Very simple, but not so easy to do. But essentially, when I was saying that my client that we analyzed, that she didn't really process her emotions, that's what I meant. She would be angry at work, but she really wouldn't pause even for a second to see, okay, how does this look like if I'm angry? So how is anger manifesting in the way that I think and in the way that I feel? When I feel angry, how does this change my worldview? Like, what's my angry filter as opposed to my relaxed filter? So how are my choices different when I'm angry? What is it that I need when I'm angry? Do I need someone to comfort me? Do I need to lock myself in the office? Do I need to, I don't know, buy a voodoo doll with my boss's face on it, or whatever it is? So that would be processing your emotions, just figuring out what you need and what the message is, and finding a way to do something actionable from a sensation. So there's no, like, it's not very mysterious what the process is, but so few people engage in it. So if the picking trance is a matter of avoiding emotions, then the only way to actually deal with it is to learn how to open up to those emotions. Because even though I guess not many people would say that, but emotions are really a way of thinking, in the sense that they are a way of making sense of the world. So when you avoid such a big part of your experience, what you're actually doing is you're depriving yourself from a whole part of your personality, a part that has its strategies, that has its ways of making meaning, that has its desires, that it has its wishes. And that's a very big part of your life. In fact, it's also a very powerful part of your life, because when it escalates, you see its true power, and also its potential. I remember when I was much younger, I used to laugh at people who would claim that they followed their intuition and just do what their feelings do. Because I was in medical school. In medical school, they don't really teach you to feel stuff. What they teach you is like what steps you need to take to do something. But then after I started learning, about psychotherapy and psychology, and started my own therapy, which is a part of the process, I started realizing that there's actually quite a lot of wisdom in it, because emotions have a logic of their own. It's just that logic is not the, if A then B, very basic logic that our thoughts operate in. And also emotions speak a different language. This is one of the reasons why I put so much art, because in my experience, art can symbolize things that my thoughts cannot think. So that's another way to process things and to give them meaning. If you remember, constriction is the black square and dilation is Bosch. So that was a much easier way, I think, to explain something, to actually convey the experience of something, than to give you a very highly technical definition that Kelly came up with. So our nonverbal parts have a lot to teach us. This is what I mean by processing emotions. It's really nothing metaphysical, and there's no woo involved. It's a very practical and down-to-earth process. So this is what I have prepared for you, and I almost made it in time. So we will go to the Q&A session. But before we do, let me just briefly introduce SkinPick's, since they're kind enough to allow us to meet every month for free. So SkinPick is an 8-week, well, an 8-session program. Let's put it that way, at least an 8-week program. It's based on acceptance and commitment therapy and habit reversal training. When you join the program, you get a therapist who will guide you every step of the way. It's all done in writing, which means that it's anonymous and that your therapist doesn't have to see you or know what you look like. You can express yourself however you like in writing, and also as much as you want and as often as you like, and talk about whatever you like. And of course, because it's done in writing, it's much more affordable than other forms of psychotherapy. Even if you don't want to or can't afford to join SkinPick, you can use the self-monitoring app for free. So let's first, before we go to the Q&A, let's see what's our topic for November. Okay, so from what I see here, habit reversal training wins by 57%, and the runner-up is perfectionism. So I will put perfectionism next month on the list so that you can vote for it if you want that as well. But in November, we'll be talking about habit reversal training.